You all for getting up early and joining us for this national conversation on deep poverty, and welcome to those of you who are joining us via live stream. I am Dr. Rosie Phillips Davis, president of the American Psychological Association, the preeminent psychology organization in America. I'd like to thank APA and our CEO, Dr. Arthur Evans, who's joining us today, for sponsoring this event. You know, the United States is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And yet, it's a country that has a lot of poverty. We believe in equal opportunity and equal access for everyone, no matter how you look or where you live. Yet 18.5 million people in these United States live in deep poverty. There's a federal definition for poverty, and 50% below that in this day and time is $12,000 or less for a family of 2 adults and 2 children. Can you imagine living on that? Our goal today is to start a conversation to examine why deep poverty continues to be so persistent here in our country. There are organizations and agencies that have delivered solutions that work, and yet poverty in these United States changes very little. I'm very interested in poverty. I grew up in deep poverty. I'm a proud daughter of a garbage man. My dad was with the sanitation department when Dr. King came to Memphis and died in 1968. So this is a topic dear to my heart. As a psychologist, I want us to use our science to find solutions that really make a difference that lasts. And I want to call on the science from other organizations to do the same thing. So we're going to talk about deep poverty, and we're going to have a moderator who is going to guide our discussion, Maureen Bunyan, who is an example of using the breadth of one's professional knowledge and role and shifting the status quo to enlighten and to move to action. Maureen Bunyan is an institution in television news in Washington and beyond. For 44 years, she anchored the 6 o'clock weekend newscast for WJLA-TV and WUSA-TV. In addition to being a leader in the newsroom, she has been an advocate for women and minorities in journalism throughout her career. She is a founder of the International Women's Media Foundation, which serves women in the media in 100 countries. She is also a founder of the National Association of Black Journalists, which inducted her into its Hall of Fame in January of 2014. In September 2016, Ms. Bunyan was named the first recipient of the Ed Walker Lifetime Achievement in Broadcasting Award. Ms. Bunyan has been honored with numerous professional and community service awards, including being named a Washingtonian of the Year. Additionally, she was inducted into the Hall of Fame of the Washington chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, the Silver Circle of the National Academy of Television Arts and Science, and the Broadcast Pioneers Club of Washington. She has been awarded 7 local Emmys and was named Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. Let me welcome and present to you our distinguished moderator, Maureen Bunyan.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Good morning. I'm so happy to be here and to be a facilitator of a very, very important discussion. I know that our panelists are going to both challenge you and inform you on this topic, and I hope that at the end of our program, we will all leave feeling inspired as well as informed. Dr. Davis, thank you so much. It's my pleasure now to present our panelists and give you a tiny bit about their backgrounds, and I mean tiny, because these are highly accomplished people and experts of the topic today. Dr. Davis, of course, and you will see also all of our panelists' biographies online, as well as in the brochure that you received when you came into the room. Dr. Davis, in addition to all that she's doing for APA and with APA, is a professor of counseling psychology at the University of Memphis, where she has been for more than 30 years. Now, Dr. Lawrence Aber, and by the way, after I do the formal introductions, I'm going to call everybody by their first names. Dr. Lawrence Aber, or Larry, is the Wilner Family Professor of Psychology and Public Policy at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at New York University. He's also a board chair of NYU's Institute of Human Development and Social Change and co-director of the International Global Ties for Children. Now, Mr. Anthony, man with a great smile here, is executive director of the National League of Cities. He's a former president of the National League. He began his career in politics at the age of 24 when he was elected mayor of South Bay, Florida. I don't know how many people start politics that early in their lives, but because of his early start, he has many, many accomplishments, and he is considered an expert in citizen engagement and the building of a sense of community within cities. Also, we're so pleased to have Dr. Caroline Ratcliffe with us. Dr. Ratcliffe is a senior fellow and co-director of the Opportunity and Ownership Initiative at the Urban Institute. She's an expert on asset building in poverty, the role of emergency savings, consumer economics, welfare programs, and other economic policies, and how they affect low-income families. She has researched, written, and testified before Congress on those issues, as well as children's poverty and how it relates to adult success. Our format is quite simple. We have about 45 to 50 minutes of discussion with the panelists, and then we open to questions from those of you in the audience. The microphone will be over to your right. I will remind you of that again so you can get up and prepare to speak. And I want to start with a very quick survey, if we could, of all of you. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands so we can identify you according to what your interests are and what your background is. Those of you who are involved in government and politics, raise your hands. You're in the minority. Those of you who are involved in healthcare, please raise your hands. Very good, thank you. Those of you who are involved in education, thank you. And those of you who are involved in nonprofit and community organizing. Aha. The nonprofit and community organizers have won so far. I wanted to do that to give our panelists a sense of who you were, who you are, and so that when they respond to your questions and when they respond to my questions, they can more clearly focus on your interests. Dr. Davis, or Rosie, if we may.
Rosie.
Let me start with you because you're a psychologist and an educator. You mentioned that you did not grow up in a family of privilege. Tell us a bit about your personal story.
Glad to do that. I grew up as one of, I'm actually one of 12 children. Most of the time, there were 9 of us living in the household with my father and mother. My dad was a garbage man for many, many years. And when I told you about the poverty rate now, that's $12,000 or less for a family of 4. Back in 1968, when Dr. King came to help those poor men and families in Memphis, the poverty level was $6,000 a year, and the deep poverty rate was $3,000 a year, family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children. I lived at that time in a family with 9 children and 2 adults, and my father made under $2,500 a year. But interestingly enough, we were not hungry because my mom was very creative about feeding us. Big pots of beans and cornbread, seasoned with fat back. And when we didn't have the beans, she'd fry a piece of meat and make gravy. And we'd eat gravy and cornbread because we had to save the meat for the next day's gravy. We were all a family who had responsibilities. Education was so important to my mom. She made sure we all went to school. We walked because I lived in the segregated South in Memphis, Tennessee, and we didn't have any money. In fact, when I was in junior high school, I would pass Elvis Presley's high school on my 2-mile trek to my high school. But it was okay because when I got to that school, there were teachers there who cared about me and said, "You're smart." Now, I'm the only one in my family who got an advanced degree, and poverty grips you. And in my family, you can find everybody, from crack addicts to the president of the American Psychological Association. But we don't give up.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosie. I want to ask you one follow-up question to your remarks. How, besides having teachers, as you described them, who were on your side and who supported you, and having a mother who pushed you, what other elements were there that helped you to move through life and to achieve what you've achieved?
There are two things. Of course, the church was there and the neighborhood, because in the neighborhood, everybody got to tell you what to do and to make sure that you continue to do the right thing. But what I like to tell children especially, the thing that really helped me was that I read early. And I read all the time. And what reading does is fuels the imagination. You see, I'd never seen a tall building, but I could dream a tall building from my readings and come up with how I wanted to live my life. And I'd like to tell the story, Maureen, that my dad was a garbage man with a third-grade education, and he knew I liked to read, so he brought me home a big old bag of books with brown wrappers on the books. And when I asked the children, why do you think they had brown wrappers? They said to keep the books clean. I said, no, there was another reason they didn't want you to see the covers of those books. And I'll leave that to your imagination. I didn't tell my dad what was in those books, but I read every one of them. Reading made the difference for me.
Thank you. Clarence, you also have a background in poverty in rural Florida. You started, as I mentioned, a career in politics at a very young age. How did you move from a poverty-stricken child to the mayor of a Florida town?
Yeah, it was interesting, Madam President. I was listening to your story, and there's just so much commonality to the basics of the nourishing life that you had. You know, I grew up in Belle Glade, Florida, a rural community. When people think of Florida, they think of sunshine and beaches. Well, there's an area, a lot of areas that consist of rural agricultural, sugarcane, celery fields, and my family was a part of a migrant family where we worked in the celery fields and the corn fields and the bean fields during the season time, which was about September to April, and we were taken out of school and we would be put on these school buses, everybody calls school buses, but basically they were old, dilapidated buses, and we would get on these buses and ride all the way to Goshen, New York, Frederick, Maryland, working in the celery fields, the corn fields.
And how old were you at this time?
I was from when I was born up until one incident happened that I think changed my life. I was in the celery fields myself, working, and they have what you call a rick-rack machine. and you're supposed to pull it down to close up the crate. And I forgot, because I was talking, much like I do now a lot, I forgot to remove my hand. And right here, there's a scar of that machine going through here and coming out here.
Oh, my goodness.
And the boss man, we called him a boss man because he was probably about 25 years old and white, would not allow me to leave the fields to go to the hospital. And so I stayed there all day long with something wrapped around my hand. And I'll never forget my mom saying, you don't belong out here. You don't belong out here. And I never forget that. And every day when I walk around cities throughout America and I see people struggling, especially women, African-American women, it touches me because it just reminds me of how hard it has been and was for my mom. Because I had a dad that drank and was basically in a lot of ways homeless because you guys are psychologists, so I just think that it just took his manhood in a lot of ways because he did have to call 24-year-olds Mr. Johnson or Mr. James, and it's just so much packed up into that every day I know I'm blessed to be where I am. And I'm so glad that Dr. Evans, it's hard for me to call him that because he's my college roommate. I will tell y'all stories later. I'm so happy that you guys are digging into this issue because it's just not one piece of economics. It's not one piece of a house. It's something that you got to dig real deep into to understand how we get folks, citizens of America, out of the cycle of poverty. And I got so much to say about that, but I'm just pleased that you guys are digging into this issue because it's a lot. It's hard.
Yes, it is.
It is very hard.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Clarence. Caroline Ratcliffe, Miss Caroline, we have heard about children and childhood poverty. Rosie and Clarence have obviously very moving personal stories, and much of your work has focused on children in poverty. Why do you do that? And can you tell us a little bit about the current status of children in deep poverty in the United States?
Thank you. Yeah. Just starting, thank you for those stories. Just as Maureen was saying, they are so moving. And I've spent a lot of my career looking at children in poverty and we've been looking at data over almost 40 years to understand the experiences of children in poverty and what that means for their adult success. So really trying to look at children from birth through adulthood. And Rosie, you started with some numbers, but just to put a few numbers, 13 million children live in poverty. So that's about 1 out of every 5 children, a little less. About half of those are in deep poverty. A lot of the work that I have done has looked at persistent poverty. And what I mean by that is children who are spending at least half of their childhood living below the poverty line. And when we can look at children, their whole experiences, we can see how many children that poverty touches. And so if we're saying 1 out of 5 children are poor right now, twice as many children, 2 out of every 5 children are poor at some point in their childhood. That's just, as you're saying, it's the wealthiest country, and we've got 40% of our children are experiencing poverty, and 1 out of 10 children are persistently poor. So they're spending half of their childhood living below the poverty line. Just one more point about some of these numbers, that what we have done is try to identify children who are the most vulnerable. And when you look at children who are born to poor parents, particularly poor, less educated parents, those are the children that are going to be much more likely to be persistently poor, and they have worse educational achievement. They are less likely to graduate from high school. They are less likely to have consistent employment in their 20s, and they're more likely to be poor. So just knowing that one piece of information, that you are born to poor parents, those are the kids that we really need to be focusing on, and we can talk about policies. But it is an epidemic.
Thank you, Caroline. Larry Aber is also with us, and Larry, you have told us that a very important report was released yesterday in which you participated in the research and the writing, and the report is entitled Reducing Child Poverty by 50% in 10 Years. Tell us about this report, where it comes from, who has taken part in it, and what it says.
Very happy to, and really thrilled to join the other panelists. And I'm very jealous of Clarence's socks. So I'm going to have to pick up my sartorial game next time I know he and I are sharing a stage. The Congress in 2015 passed, as part of an omnibus budget act, an instruction to the National Academy of Science to create a committee to do three things. The first was to review the extensive literature that Caroline referred to about what was the associations and impacts of child poverty on child well-being. The second is to do an objective analysis of how the policies we have in place impact child poverty at the moment. And the third is to come up with evidence-based recommendations to, as Maureen mentioned, reduce child poverty by 50% in 10 years. That sounds like a historically very ambitious and maybe unprecedented goal. It's not. If you actually measure poverty using the best measures we have available now, America has reduced child poverty over the last 40 years by about half. It took us 40 years to do it. England reduced child poverty by half in about 7 years back in the 2000s. And Canada is going to reduce child poverty by half in a couple of years, right now. So that's possible to achieve. There's three take-home messages, and I'm happy to talk about them later. Take-home message number one is, it's a little bit like the Surgeon General's report on smoking years ago. My mom knew that smoking wasn't good for you, but there wasn't scientific proof of the causality that smoking caused illness. Our report establishes causality. Child poverty causes problems in children's mental health and learning. And there are many other correlated factors that are at risk, but poverty itself, low income, is a causal factor. That's message number one. Message number two is our poverty rate would be about 50% higher than it is right now without the policies we have in place, ranging from food stamps to housing subsidies to the earned income tax credit to the child tax credit. We are cutting poverty now. And the third take-home message is that a series of policy changes could reduce child poverty by fully 50% in 10 years. So that's the news, and it came out yesterday. So.
Thank you. That's really, really remarkable. I want to help us get a little more meat on the bone of the difference between entrenched poverty and, quote, poverty, deep poverty and non-deep poverty. Why are those terms important? Why can't we just say people are poor, period? And I know we talk about income levels as being part of the definition, but what else goes into the definition of the very poor, the entrenched poor, the deep poor, and other people who are also poor?
I think I can just start. One piece is when we talk about poverty, and what we're really talking about is deprivation and instability and vulnerability. And the further down the income scale you go, the more vulnerability and instability in the lives of the parents and the children. And we need to really be thinking about that financial stress isn't just about the parents, that it tumbles down into the lives of children. And Larry's point about poverty causes these things, a lot of this is around financial stress and what children experience, and that for children who are very young, the research shows it changes the way that their brains develop. I mean, that is amazing. And I mean, amazingly sad, but so important that we have this research that shows that these children, the way their brain develops, the way the synapses happen in their brain, that those are forever changed. And some of my research, it's not just how long children are poor, but when you look at that first 1,000 days, it's in utero, up to age 2 or 3, that those are the most important times in children's lives, and that we can talk about this more afterwards, but maternal depression is a big issue for mothers of, poor mothers of infants. And that's going to affect the way they nurture their children and the well-being of those children as they grow up.
May I add this point, that when you're saying put more meat on the bones, actually, the federal definition of poverty was established back in 1963. And it just said, what is the pre-tax income it takes for someone to have a minimal food diet, just a small amount of food, but they can eat? When you think that that's poverty, and deep poverty is half that, we're talking about people who can't eat. That's as plain as it can get, because there is no meat on the bone for those individuals. And so when we begin to think that we're willing to let children not even have food to eat in our country, it's a major problem, not only for our good health, but certainly for their good health.
And I'll also add, from local communities' perspective, deep poverty is a determinant of success. If you don't have health care, you just think about that. As you get older, even if you get it, you didn't go to the doctor. Dental, people are not able to have basic services, a house or home. All of those things are determinants of success. And if you don't have those things at a very young age, and it's even deeper when you don't have a roof over your head or you're not drinking quality water. There's residents in our cities throughout America right now that the turbidity rate and the quality of their water is going to affect their health for the rest of their lives. And so deep poverty is something that it's hard to even imagine that people don't have the things that we have in this room, or those that are watching this program today. But it exists in America, especially with children, more so with women than men, and more so with people of color in America. One of the highest determinants of poverty is race in America. Native Americans are around, 26%, and African Americans are 25 or so. It's something that we got to grapple with here in America, or we're going to leave a lot of people behind in terms of having vibrant Americans help us to continue to create the country that we love and appreciate so much.
May I add just one comment?
Yes, please.
It might help our listeners to translate $12,000 a year for a family of 4 into a daily wage for each person. It's $10 a day per person, less than $10 a day, and that's $12,000. If it's $6,000, it's less than $5 a day. So imagine living on $10 a day per person in your household. Another way of making Rosie's point. That's really quite a low figure. But I also want to emphasize Caroline's point, which is that it's not just, imagine making $10 a day or having $10 a day, but some days you have none and some days you have 20, and you don't know which day is which. That's what income instability is, okay? All of us would rather have $10 a day than $20 one day and zero the next, because, and especially unpredictably, that drives families wild. I mean, just nuts. It creates toxic stress. That toxic stress can have the effect that Caroline was describing. She used the term, and we might disagree a little bit here, it affects a child for a lifetime. It affects a child for a lifetime if it doesn't go unaddressed. But humans are plastic, they're malleable, they're changeable. So I think it's very, very important to know the dangers, the long-term dangers of child poverty, but not to accidentally think that it dooms somebody to a lifetime of limits. It's a lifetime of limits if we don't address it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other
Yeah,
thing,
I would agree.
let me just
I
say
gotta
one
push-
more thing.
okay,
And
all right.
Okay, now we're getting into it.
We're about to have
yeah. No, one of the things that I want to say, because I want all of us to be conscious that poverty affects all of us. And even though the percentages are higher by ethnic groups, there are 8 million more white people living in poverty than black people. I just want all of you to understand that poverty knows no boundaries when it comes to what we look like and who we are.
And it costs the entire nation.
Exactly.
Our estimates are that child poverty costs the nation $800 billion to $1.1 trillion a year.
And where do those costs come from? What are
The
they?
costs we've been able to estimate so far come from lost productivity. If poverty causes low education, which causes lower wages, it is higher healthcare costs. If poverty causes ill health, causes more healthcare costs. In criminal justice involvement. But those are really the only things we've been able to estimate. So the $800 billion to $1.1 trillion, in my opinion, is a conservative estimate. But that affects the whole nation too. It's in just the way Rosie was describing.
Clarence, you had a...
Yeah, I agree with you that the whole concept is not about limitations, because all of us are examples of how you can pull yourself up. But I can also say that looking at the community I grew up in and the number of people that did not get out and still suffer from poor health care, high blood pressure, diabetes because of lack of access to health care and dental care. Infant mortality rate continues to be high. Yes, I am very blessed that I was able to, but if there were 100 people in my high school class, 80 of them did not get out. And so I don't want our listeners to leave this thinking that the American dream is that easy. Because as psychologists, I can tell you that you guys recognize very much so how one or two experiences in your life can change who you are, and you're no longer plastic.
Yeah,
You're
both
human.
these things
so
are
I
true.
wanted to respond to that because I
No.
do think it's important. And I also want to say that I agree that this is an American problem. It's not, white, blacks, Hispanics, Native American, Asian. But as a percentage, as it relates to poverty and the challenge to create and get that American dream, it is more difficult for women of color and people of color.
Couldn't agree
So I
more.
don't
That's
want
true.
that to be
Yeah.
lost in this conversation.
Can I add a number to this?
Yeah, go ahead.
So when we look
I'm sorry,
at children who are persistently poor, so we know that education is critical for future economic success, productivity. Among persistently poor children, 3% of them go to college and complete college by their mid to late 20s. 3%. So that is an epidemic. That is lost productivity. That is loss of opportunity and success, not just for those children, but for all of us. And so I think that puts a point right on what you're saying, is that opportunity is not equal for all.
Right.
You know, one of the reasons that I want us to know that it affects all ethnicities and all races is that I've gone around the country and talked to various state psychological association conventions. What I've sometimes gotten from white individuals was that, oh, I didn't know it was us too, our other. And it doesn't actually make any difference, because my poverty affects you just as Larry is saying, does not matter. But to be vivid and visual about that is a part of what I want people to know. And I don't want people to turn their eyes away from what the prize is if we all achieve. And it is true in my family, we had death from poverty. And some other research that I like is that research by Chetty and Hendren that talks about what happens. And so part of this got my attention in 2016 when I was listening to NPR, and it was the pulling yourself up, the myths of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And Chetty and Hendren's research showed that if you're in the economic bottom quintile, that your chances for moving to the top quintile in the United States is 12.9% in San Jose, California. And what perked my ears up, and if you're in Memphis, Tennessee, your chances are 3%.
Wow.
That affects everybody. We must change it.
And I agree with you, Madam President, because what I don't want to leave here with is that when you say the word poverty, you put a face to it that is not a diverse face.
Yes.
And that is true. You know, the assumption, even on public policy leaders, when you say citizens that are poor, you put a face to that, or you say citizens that are on welfare, you have a face. I don't want to leave this panel having people to think that that face is people of color and other minority communities. It is a face that walks around Washington, D.C. and Memphis and the beautiful state of Florida every day, and it is not just people of color, but the deeper issue that I think America has not dealt with has been that issue. So thank you.
Oh, yeah.
I'd like to direct a question to Larry. And you have traveled, you have done research, I know, in Africa on childhood poverty and other issues. And we as Americans love to compare our country with other nations, especially when the comparison makes us look good. But the comparison of childhood poverty, especially with other nations, does not make us look good. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and help us to understand how it is that we, as an industrialized, so-called developed nation, have higher levels of childhood poverty and general poverty than the nations of Europe, of Canada, also industrialized, also developed countries.
We covered this issue a bit in the report, and I just wanted to mention for the folks here that there are handouts of the summary of the report out on the table if you didn't pick them up, and people can get it from our listening audience at www.nap.edu/reducing child poverty. So there's ability to look at all that. Very quickly, America has among the highest child poverty rates of any of the Western industrialized countries. Our child poverty rates are 2 to 3 times higher than our nearest neighbors, with one exception. What distinguishes America from those other countries is not what economists call market poverty, market income. Our households make about the same amount of money, but after tax and transfers, our families are poorer. Said another way, our poverty is created by policy. Our poverty, the differences between the nations is created by our policies. We
And
are
these
not
are-
as
these are
generous.
governmental
We are not
policies.
as generous as other countries. The way Europe gets child poverty down into the single digits is largely through something called a child allowance or a family allowance. A child allowance or family allowance is a nation's recognition that it costs money to raise children and the nation should support them. So one of the key policy recommendations, policy changes in our report is for a child allowance. And so poverty is not a natural law. It's a human creation.
We'll certainly, we're going to have time to delve deeper into that, but why is it then that Canada or the UK or the Netherlands, the government's policies have favored financial support of the citizens of those countries? Why is it that their attitude toward poverty is, I would say, fundamentally different than ours?
There's huge areas of scholarship that I'm humbled in the face of about these issues. But most of those countries were not built on slavery. This is now me not talking as the National Academy of Science. This is Larry. Our American way of up by bootstraps, individualism, rugged individualism, that the support of family and community and church is in the private sector, not in the public sector. There's something about that ethos that changes. But I actually think that that's changing some in this country. So,
Well, we have to talk about that too. Before we get to some of these other issues, I want to continue to set the table and to create a map in our minds. First, I'd like to ask our panelists to talk about some of the structural policies, the institutional policies, the governmental policies that you referred to, Larry, and those policies in our country that have promoted, or at least benignly or purposely promoted poverty in the United States. You mentioned one, Larry, our history of racial injustice. Let's start, and I've myself put this into 4 areas. So I'd like to start and get comments from each of you on what forces in the governments of this country, whether it's a federal government or state or local governments, promote institutional poverty.
Well, I'll start because I am not the expert on poverty. I'm passionate about it. But
you do a pretty good job.
But I will start with looking at some of those very policies that you're talking about. When we look at the history of slavery and racism and whatnot, that's kind of built into our DNA in this country right now. If we use policies that promote financing the wealthy, and so everyone knows that we have an increasing gap between the very rich and the very poor. When you have major billion-dollar companies not paying any taxes, and that's our policies at work, and you have really poor people who still have to pay taxes, there's something wrong with a system like that. And that distribution of wealth that causes people to be even more poor then affects all of us. When we have systems that don't pay for education of our citizens and then even takes our tax dollars to pay for private education, leaving those institutions even more destitute, that's a problem for us in our country. And we've already heard about the differences between the education of poor children and wealthy children when poor children enter fourth grade, it's not unusual for there to be a 26-point reading gap between those poor children and wealthy children, and yet our policies allow those kinds of practices to take place.
Larry, you mentioned some of the policies of the governments of European countries and Canada. If those countries had not instituted the policies that they have in effect now, minimum wage, support of families, et cetera, what shape would they be in?
They would have higher child poverty rates. And I think we're learning that the structure and nature of policies have direct influences on poverty rates and then therefore child well-being. Some of it is what we don't do. We don't do child allowances. We do, as Rosie mentioned, do what are called child tax credits, but they only kick in after you make a certain amount of money. It's a credit against your tax. The European system makes it so that you don't require income to claim the child tax credit. So we're suggesting moving away from the child tax credit to a child allowance, which allows us to pay for it to some extent. So, but let me just give two other examples. Right now, a very large number of our welfare benefits, our social benefits, are conditioned on work. Parents have to work to be eligible for things. Many states are exploring work requirements for receiving food stamps, for receiving Medicaid. If you're in a structural situation where, because of racial and ethnic discrimination in the labor and housing market, people are farther away from jobs, if because of a history of illness, people are too sick to get to jobs, if because of a history of segregation, they live in neighborhoods that are farther away from jobs. None of those say, we discriminate against you. All of them lead to a different racial and ethnic impact of work requirements. Now, Americans deeply believe in work being the pathway out of poverty, and I'm not saying we don't want to support work. Our policies actually support work and increase income at the same time, and that's the goal we should be setting for our policies.
So what would you say to Ivanka Trump?
Nice shoes. I'd also like to add, it's funny, I think back in Dr. Evans and my dorm room, and these are the kind of discussions we used to have till like 2 o'clock in the morning. How we're gonna...
We're not gonna do that today.
Yeah, it's philosophical discussions about our nation and policies. And clearly we got the SNAP program and the WIC program that's around nutrition and helping women with children in terms of our policy initiatives. I think, though, that to have a sense of pride is to have a job and to be able to earn proper wages. And we have minimum wages in our nation right now that so disappointing because we know that $13.25 or $12 an hour is not going to help someone pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We know that, but yet we won't create policies to help people get out of poverty. You know, in St. Louis, Missouri, there was a resident there, named was Betty Davis, who was working at McDonald's, and the city decided to increase the minimum wage within the city. And the state lawmakers saw what the cities were doing and passed a law to repeal city minimum wage laws. Now, that movement to $14 or $15 an hour for Ms. Davis and her family was a movie. Maybe ice cream after church on Sunday. But the fact that the state took that ability away and also took a sense of pride, because to be able to take your kid out and provide an ice cream cone or a movie is something that we all take for granted. But that's what they did by repealing that law. And we've worked together on initiatives, National League of Cities and Urban Institute, around poverty and financial growth and lifting someone up. And just another example from a city's perspective that we have to work on. I grew up when our water bill was cut off, and I didn't think about this until we did some research on Lyft with you guys. And first the water gets cut off, then you get a penalty, right, for late, then you got to pay for reconnecting it, then you got to catch up from that connection. What cycle of deep poverty are we continuing to create in even cities that I represent throughout America? So I think as we look at our policies at the federal, state, as well as city level, we got to think as if we're really serving the people that live in Memphis. We got to think about the people that are in South Bay and Belgrade, Florida, that just can't make it to that next step of pride. And that's what we work for. At least I work to get my members to think through, not about where we're sitting here today, but how do we develop policies for those people who just can't get that next piece of that ladder in America.
Caroline?
Yeah, can I just add to your question about the policies, and I have lots of things to say, but I'll keep it short. But just like what's entrenched in our policies, when we look at our cash assistance program, so our primary program targeted at helping families with children, so that's the temporary assistance for needy families. So the first word now, temporary, but less than 25% of families with children receive TANF benefits. So here's a program that's aimed at poor children, and many, many children and families are not receiving that as assistance. It's now temporary. There are different requirements. In some states, it's less than 10% of families with children are receiving this. And when we talk about work, and I agree with everything Larry said about transportation, but what about childcare? Childcare is underfunded. It's a critical element for people to be able to get to work. And so just to kind of add that to the conversation, and also in the minimum wage, I agree with you. But one of the things we can't forget about is people who are tip workers. I know this was a big issue in DC, but what we find in our research, let me say that cash assistance, it is not high enough to take any family out of poverty, right? It can take people over the line of deep poverty, but those values are very low. But a lot of these tip workers in our research, that's where we're finding particular vulnerability and poverty and deep poverty. So I think we just can't forget about workers that aren't covered under the traditional minimum wage and think about these tip workers.
You bring me to the next area that I'd like to ask about, our business community and the forces, the structural and policies in the world of American business, the corporate structure, et cetera, that promote poverty. You already talked about the fact that people who are working for tips are affected, but the business community has obviously recently come under a lot of fire for business practices that help to promote, some call it welfare for the wealthy, as opposed to, and to promote the exploitation of people who are in poverty. Among those policies and businesses that have come under attack are the dollar store company, payday loans, obviously on a different scale. There's a lot of talk now about how the government, in effect, subsidizes corporate development. For example, government subsidies to Amazon to come into communities, government subsidies that help pay for huge sports stadiums around the country, money that is tax savings to these corporations and companies. So let's talk about the business world and what impact the business world has on the poor in our country.
Two things. The first is the National Academy of Science report did not address this issue. We were not charged by Congress to address this issue. We were charged to address federal public policies. I do believe that, now I'm speaking strictly personally, I believe we need a national business plan to reduce child poverty too. That the business community has multiple roles it could play and is creating multiple constraints as well, many of the ones that you mentioned. I think businesses that are forward-looking recognize that there is no substitute to workers who are less stressed and more skilled and therefore able to do their jobs better. So I think that we have to find a way of tying business interests to the national task of reducing child poverty. That's me speaking, not the National Academy, but I used to run the National Center for Children in Poverty at Columbia for 10 years, so I've been thinking about these things for a long time. And I think that in addition to the business community, as has been spoken to many times already by the panel, families, communities, churches all have roles to play. They are all relatively minor roles in actually reducing child poverty numbers compared to federal policy, but they're indispensable to improving lives. It's not, reducing child poverty will improve lives. There are many things that could be done by families, communities, churches, business to improve people's lives too, and to help reduce poverty, but they're going to be more improving lives than reducing poverty, I'm afraid.
I can tell you.
Go ahead.
I am all for successful corporations and businesses. I love Federal Express. It's a big company in Memphis. I do. Yeah. I would have taken Amazon in Memphis. I do. Those are jobs, and they help people. And they are partners with, there's an organization I'm a part of called the Women's Foundation for Greater Memphis. And their job, our task, mission, is to reduce poverty, especially among women. We're focused on women. And so the Women's Foundation has taken an approach with a neighborhood, an entire neighborhood, zip code 38126, and we created something called Vision 2020, and that's to reduce poverty by 1 percentage point every year for 5 years, and we've begun to do that. We have 79 partners, including businesses and corporations. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of what's happened from 2016 when we launched until now. In the first year, 407 children were enrolled in early education and child care programs. A year later, we had 543. 1 year after launch, we had 5 people buying homes. The next year, we had 7 people buying homes. We had in 1 year a 20% increase in income. The next year, a 44% increase in income. That's all those people working together, including our businesses and corporations. But I think you're right, Larry. We've got to do more about changing structure and policy, but it can be done. We even had foundations. The Annie Casey Foundation came in to help. But that's taken a lot of us to get even these small numbers, but they're dramatic numbers. So I'm all for successful corporations. I'm just in favor of spreading the wealth.
I agree with that. I think.
Could I
Yeah,
ask
please, go ahead.
Larry to follow up on that? Because I'm trying to understand, and maybe some of you are trying to understand, which elements of our society are the most involved in the promotion of poverty? Is it our governmental policies, and they go across the board, policies about banking regulations, taxation, promotion of business? Are they the nonprofits and the organizations like your women's group in Memphis working with corporations? Because a lot of people, and I confess to be one of them, I see our business community in many ways picking up the slack for governmental, the lack of governmental presence, and then benefiting from it because they give money to charities, et cetera, that help to stop poverty, but that money is non-taxable, or the business communities get a tax refund. We all know about this part of our world. So, and this does not happen in other countries. We are experts at doing this. We are transferring the responsibilities for serving society from the government to the private sector. So
Well, I'm going
help
to
me
say
be
something real quick
unconfused.
and then hope that my panelists have something smarter to say than me. But what I want to say real quickly is that the philanthropic sector lags behind in Europe. It's really only recently that private charitable giving of a certain scale has begun. And they have relied more on public policies than private charities to do those things. Not that there isn't a history of private charities, but just not at that scale. And you ask an enormously important question, Maureen, and I'm humbled again to have nothing to say from the National Academy of Sciences and nothing to say from Larry about that, because that's a biggie. Hopefully other colleagues have better ideas than me on that one.
I don't have a complete answer. It is such a big question. But I think it just is in so many different pieces where we lag. And we think, so our policies and our programs aren't lifting families up. And we often talk about the cost of being poor. You asked about payday loans and financial sector. When you think about somebody and transportation and getting people to those jobs, that's another piece in this. And when you look at, if somebody's car breaks down and it's going to cost $500 to fix, and you can put that on a credit card and pay it off in 3 months, you're talking about $16, $20 in interest. If you have to take out a payday loan for 3 months, you're going to pay about $350 to $450 in interest for that. So talk about the cost of being poor, that they're hit in multiple different ways. And there are some employers are a little bit more on the forefront and trying to provide better financial health, provide loans for employees, and they're finding that it's not just low-income people who are taking these up, but very much middle-income folks who need these loans, who are also financially insecure. But there are real costs to being poor and the instability and dealing with those financial hits and how you're able to overcome them. Think about your social networks. If some young person who their parents are well off, their car breaks down, they can borrow that money. But for someone else who doesn't have those same social networks, that can really take them down a cycle and sort of that can cascade into much more hardship.
And I want to agree with Rosie, our president, and just say that the business community is very important to our economic system, the growth, the jobs, the housing opportunities in cities all over America. And when it comes to those incentives that you referred to, Maureen, there is local discussion every day of whether or not a city should put billions of dollars aside to recruit a corporation to their region. whatever that corporation is. And is it a good investment or not? Should the city be putting more money into neighborhoods, for example? And I do think that there's a local decision to be made by every city, town, and village in America. What is the priority? Is investing in recruiting 12 to 25,000 jobs important now so that people can at least have a job to move themselves up? Should they put money in another system? My answer to that is that it's going to take all of that. It's going to take the philanthropic community, it's going to take the cities, it's going to take the private sector and the federal government to work together to address this deep poverty that we're talking about. And I'm using the word intentionally, deep poverty, to get people out of that. It's not going to take one sector, and putting them against each other in this time in America is just not very helpful. But it is city by city, local communities by local communities, and I hate to tell us this in Washington, D.C., but don't wait on the federal government, because mayors and council members all over America, they are not waiting. They're developing communities to the culture that they want, not from the federal level.
And we just need to make sure that there's affordable housing, that they're preserving affordable housing in these communities where there's this infusion of funds.
Now, that is a big issue that we probably could talk
All day.
a long time.
But let me add just one more thing, though, because I don't want us to let the federal government off the hook. Because
Thank you, Madam President.
Because here's the deal.
Yeah.
When we look at fundamentally the changes that have happened that are from the federal government, just look at the Constitution. Just look at what happened to women when women got the right to vote. Just look at what happens when we gerrymander or not. Just look at what happened when FDR was president.
War on
And look
poverty.
at, yes, Johnson, war on poverty. Look at Social Security and that social safety net. So yes, we cannot let our federal government off the hook, and we have got to make fundamental structural changes. And I think that is the foundation. Corporations come and go, but we have to have something that is the foundation.
I agree with that 100%. But if we're going to wait on the federal government,
No, we don't wanna wait.
We're going to wait.
We don't want to wait.
Okay.
We don't want to wait.
So
We don't
all
want. I just don't want to let them off the
You
hook.
and I are agreeing that I think we need a federal partner. And
Yeah.
that's my message all over America. But I will tell you now, given the environment that we are in terms of the partisanship in Washington, D.C., and very little getting done, we cannot afford to wait. And we got to go back to Memphis
Yeah.
and the foundation, the Women's Foundation that you helped found. We got to create those kinds of networks, as you spoke about, Caroline, to address these issues, because I want to be positive about this, but we're not going to get that federal overview that we need. We need our city leaders to work with all of us to get
Larry?
it done.
I think this is a very productive conversation. I want to just give one example of one of the largest federal programs now that fights poverty, the Earned Income Tax Credit.
Yeah.
The Earned Income Tax Credit was actually supported by both Republican and Democratic presidents, both Republican and Democratic members of Congress, has been raised several times by bipartisan support. So it is possible to find some strategies that have bipartisan support, and the Earned Income Tax Credit is one of the 3 or 4 major policies that have led to the decline in child poverty in America over the last 40 years. But it's too slow and not deep enough yet to the cuts deep enough. What the reason I'm raising it is the Earned Income Tax Credits help marginal businesses pay their workers a little more. It's a subsidy And because a lot of the employers of low-wage workers are poor businesses, are businesses that are on very low margins. So it's a very complex issue. And I think that shows a nice combination of what the federal government can do by way of incentive on the one hand versus, and how local communities and businesses respond to that. That's an aid to local businesses and communities, even though it's a federal policy.
Let's go on to another area we didn't conspire to decide which particular areas we wanted to talk about. I simply decided this is what I wanted to hear you say.
The prerogative of the moderator. Good moderator.
Education. Caroline touched on that, and both Larry and, well, all of you touched on it, but especially the role of education in your life, Rosie, and in your life, Larry. Clarence. We use education as a pivotal point in describing how people can get out of poverty, and especially as it relates, obviously, to childhood development. What are the policies and what is the structural basis that helps keep education out of the equation when we discuss poverty? Because besides saying things like, you've got to get a good education, or you can't get ahead, study hard and you'll get a good job, etc., which your families said, and which my family said, and I'm sure everybody's heard this, but we can't educate ourselves. We have to depend on the institutions around us and the policies that will promote it. So on the subject of education, what are we lacking in our service and in what we offer to poor children and poor families?
You want me to start? Well, I think for me what I see is a distortion in why we ought to be funding public education. I think that we must be committed, and what we've seen is more and more, education has been one part of the budget, whether it's state or local, that has discretion. And so people can cut those budgets. And so they cut those budgets to serve other needs, and they say that those things are good. But when you cut them and the schools suffer and the children don't get what they need, when you cut those budgets and teachers are not paid, when teachers are not paid and so they don't stay, or when they don't get the support they need when they are there and so they leave, that has an impact on what is happening to our children. So when I was growing up, getting a teaching job was a great job for a black person. And so we had some of the best and the brightest. When we actually desegregated our schools, though, they took our best and brightest and moved them out to white schools. And they tried to do that with some of the students, too. So even race permeates that. And we cut, even with some of the charter schools, and the fact that they aren't doing as well, but we have outside people coming in saying this is the way to do it, but it's not evidence-based. I believe that if we go with evidence-based and build our educational structures and what we pay teachers and the services we give, that will make a difference. But right now it's discretionary, and so they suffer at the hands of cuts, and we must change that, which is why I'm a big fan of voting.
Do any of you have any thoughts about the discussions about the nature, the source of educational funding?
Yeah.
Of course, we have a system in this country in which the local communities decide how much money they're putting into the local schools, local school boards. We also have state funding and federal funding. But for most communities, the major source of funding is local. So if you live in a poor community with a low tax revenue, you get bad schools.
Yeah.
So, and this continues, obviously, generation after generation. I answered my own question?
Yeah.
When you asked that question,
how
I
does
wrote
this fit
down
in?
local funding of schools. You hear about people buying houses in good school districts, that the price of houses, when you go into the area that goes to this school, that's high quality, the value of homes goes up. And so we are, because of housing prices and rental prices, we are excluding lower income children from these better schools. And so my research doesn't touch on this, but I've thought of this many times. When we look at the federal budget, and going back to not letting the federal government off the hook, some of my colleagues have done research looking at what share of the federal budget goes to children. 9% of the federal budget goes to children, and when you look at low-income children, it's about 6%.
You mean 9% of the education budget or 9% of the entire?
Entire federal budget. And that I think the way that our schools are funded at the local level, I think is a big issue. Again, it's not an area where I've done research, but I think we need to, if we're gonna have more equal opportunity, then that has to start in the schools, and it's funding of that is a key element.
There is nothing free, and we have to pay for education. And you know, it's so interesting. We started education in this country and started public education, and then people got perks, got wealthy, and then move out. So now rich people don't know poor people. They don't live in the same neighborhood. And then start private schools, and then resent paying $30,000 a year for their children to go to the private school. Well, we need to change that so that the public schools, no matter where they're situated, are great schools. Mm-hmm. We have to change those kinds of policies and those kinds of structures.
And I'll just add that I agree with both of you guys on those points. And we know that the success in America, yeah, it's where you're born or the family, if you get lucky enough to be born in a certain family, but it's also education is probably one of the most important things that one must get. And if we're going to do that, and we recognize that, we have to have a source that's dedicated, whether in the state of Florida, you know, they approve gambling, for example, or the lottery. And there is that dedicated source for education. There are other states doing other things that would dedicate dollars. We also need to, again, recognize how it needs to be comprehensive. You talked about the war and poverty legislation in the 1968 or so that was developed. That policy was supposed to be comprehensive. One program that I benefited from was the Head Start program, right? So it was not just helping me to get exposed and get it developed. It also helped my mom to get a high school education. And so when I came home, I'm the baby of 6, I'll always be the baby. And I would speak correctly, start saying police instead of police and things like that. My siblings were just like, oh, he's trying to be proper. Well, my mom said, no, he's starting. So I had reinforcement there as I started to develop and become more educated, if you will. So there's so much that funding needs to be there, the infrastructure needs to be there, and it has to be comprehensive, because if you give a person one piece of a life and you don't develop them in other areas, believe it, they won't be able to be successful, even if they have that education. But funding is important. Public education is important. Privatization, charter schools, and things like that. We, again, like housing, Caroline, we could have a in-depth discussion. I just want my kids to have access, y'all. So that could be a real good conversation to have as well.
Larry, we haven't heard from you on this topic.
2 things.
Who are you speaking for, Larry? Make sure.
First, the Academy.
Okay.
I want to emphasize that our report is on what could happen to reduce child poverty in the next 10 years. Education is critical to turning around poverty, but it's on a longer time course. We're not going to see reductions in child poverty rates within 10 years by most of the policies. It'll take till the children are grown that you see the big effects of those long-term ones. So I'm hoping that there's a second National Academy of Sciences committee on intergenerational poverty and how to break poverty over the generations. So that's me on the academy. Now, me as Larry and as a professor at an education school, I would say two other things. The first is that the last 25 years of education reform has been focusing almost exclusively on academic standards, and those are important. But we've left out the whole child. We've left out sports and art and music and recreation, and we've left out social and emotional learning. And social emotional learning is also a race, ethnic, and socioeconomically graded issue. And for those of you who are interested, I would encourage you to check out the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning in Chicago, which is doing really remarkable work on education reform, fusing social emotional principles into academic instruction. Because kids their emotions, their social relationships are fundamental, and we almost leave them out as part of the education reform. The second is, I think it's enormously promising what's been going on in dozens of communities around the country around promoting socioeconomic integration in the schools. Because race is a constitutionally protected class, communities can't be as ambitious in integrating their schools by race, but because race and socioeconomic class are so correlated, it is possible to socioeconomically integrate our communities, and that would have a lot of the same beneficial impacts that you all have been talking about earlier today.
I'd like to change the subject, if you don't mind.
It's your prerogative, Madam.
To something that's very close to my profession, which is the creation of stories. And I'd like to have you each comment on the psychological issues as well as others, but mostly the psychological issues that we face in our society as we look at how to alleviate poverty. And it's up to you to decide what you want to say. I will start off by just giving a small sense of my thinking. How one frames a question, how one frames a statement, how one frames a story is sometimes more important than the actual content of the story. In our country, the myths about poverty are sometimes more difficult to break through than the actual poverty. And I see at least two sides to this. One is the attitudes that the poor develop about their status. The mostly negative attitudes, of course, I'm thinking of, which are, I'm nobody. I have no money, so I'm nobody in our society, in our capitalist and consumer society. My dad didn't have money, my mother didn't have money, they worked as X, Y, and Z. I will be doing that too for the rest of my life, and so will my children. So the negative attitudes that are acquired and that are placed upon the poor by the other side, which is people who are not poor, who look at the poor as victims of their own doing, who do not see poverty as part of an entrenched system, and who therefore say, well, if you don't want to be poor, it's up to you. You know, we know the cliches. And they also attribute poverty, people in poverty, to having loose morals. They don't go to church enough. They should pray more to get out of poverty. They should stand up and push their children, et cetera, et cetera. So we have, to me, a mirror of the poor person looking into the mirror saying, I'm not worthy. And then we have the other side of the mirror of the non-poor person looking and saying, they're not worthy. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, since you said psychology, probably they want Larry or me to start, right?
They want you to start.
There is something called the just world philosophy that children don't start out believing, but they begin to believe probably when they get to be about preteens, early teens, that says that I got what I deserve. But I don't think children start out believing I'm poor and I'm never going to amount to anything. They start out thinking that the world is theirs and that they can accomplish anything. And then it becomes, what do we expose them to? And one of the things I'm blessed to do is still live in a family that lives in deep poverty. And so I can look at my nieces and nephews and what is happening to them. And I watch my nephew, who, even though he's poor, he still had access to one of those little phones. And so I don't let him play on his phone when he's around me. And so one day I walk in and he's playing on the phone. I said, what are you doing? He's doing a story. And so why don't you create your own story? And I make him stop and write a story. And he's writing a story about some superheroes. And they've got to get out of the academy by jumping off a tall building. And I said, well, how tall is the building? I don't know. I know what the Eiffel Tower looks like. But what's a tall building? I don't know. He doesn't know because he doesn't get out in his neighborhood. So I put him in my car and drive him to the third largest, tallest building in Memphis and make him get out and count the stories of the building. And so now he can begin to see. He can begin to see. And so for him, then, it widens his world. And I have to keep working with him so he doesn't start to believe that just because his mom has to work 3 jobs, he won't get to have anything. So my job is to keep them seeing heights and believing. And that's what we must do, because if they don't, they settle into that. And they do start to believe that that is all that they get to have. I can't allow it.
Wow. Going to just take a second and let that sink in. That's good stuff. Maureen used the term frame, and for those in our audience who don't know about strategic frame analysis, there's actually now a science of communications that is investigating how the frames that are invoked in stories lead people to prefer certain types of causes as the explanations for social problems and prefer certain types of solutions. And go to frameworksinstitute.org, and they have all sorts of stuff about this, including how to frame things to deal with misattributions of problems. So let me be concrete about one example. You've all heard the term, there was a war on poverty and poverty won. Boy, is that catchy. And poverty still exists among us. So we didn't eliminate poverty. But I've already told you, poverty's declined by 50% in 40 years in America. Poverty is not an intractable problem. There was a war on poverty and poverty won is not true, but it's a powerful frame. And if you get that frame, it's hard to get out of it. Mm-hmm. So I think stories that are fact-based stories and communications that actually have our desired effect are fundamental to changing poverty in America. I couldn't agree more.
You know, when you were asking, framing that question, it really sort of became a little emotional because those are the things that you hear in your mind, even as you mature as a man and as an adult. It doesn't go away when you start where I started from. And the thing I started thinking about is, as a little kid growing up in deep poverty, was that always dreaming, always dreaming. They always would say, when I would say, I'm going to be president of the United States, they say, oh, you're not going to be nothing, right? But somehow, the one thing I want to leave you guys with, I was loved. Isn't that amazing? I did not know I was poor until I went to college, and Ace, Dr. Evans and I,
He told you that you were poor? That's your source?
No, he didn't, but I remember taking a sociology class and they asked us to go to the library to look at Harvest of Shame, Edward R. Murrow's Harvest of Shame. And my family was in the documentary. I did not realize that I was poor because I had love. I was happy because everybody around me was poor. And so I think the things that happen for you is that network, whether you're a single family, is that neighborhood that you talked about, Rosie, and it's riding in that bus in a migrant family and seeing bridges every time you're coming to a city. I would always get so excited when I saw the bridge because I knew I was coming into a city. And I think about those experiences, and I think that's how I got to where I am today. It was something about seeing the lights of New York or seeing the lights of Baltimore, knowing that I can live in that city, knowing I can get out of there. No, in spite of what anyone else said, I had the mentality to be able to overcome that negative energy that I was feeling. It came back to I knew I was loved, right? And you talk about the psychology of that. I could have given up in college because I remember taking a test and getting a 90. And the professor said, there's no way that you could have made a 90 on that test. And I had to take the test over. Wow. To prove that I had done that. Every day where I started impacts where I am today. Questioning, do I belong here? Even today. So as you talk about the mental impacts, we need to recognize that we bring who we are to what we do. And sometimes even the most confident person that you see still have those voices in their heads saying, you started in Belglade, Florida, working in a celery field. What the hell are you doing as CEO of the National League of Cities? That happens inside of my head, in spite of what happens inside of your head. And I think of it every day, and I want you guys to know what we are trying to overcome as the American Psychological Association, and you partnering with nonprofits, churches. Your voices can be so amazing, not just at the university and clinics and in your own practices, but I'm just here today to just challenge us in a most difficult way to get outside, to use the association, Dr. Evans, to help address some of these voices that we're hearing. So I may have a session later if anybody has a bed for me. I ain't got no money. Now I'm poor. That's one thing my staff would tell you. I still have a poor man's mentality when it comes to our budget and stuff. But that's how it's built, and voices are still there.
And are there any psychiatrists in the room who would like to do some counseling and maybe prescribe some medications?
Yeah.
Well, we have some psychologists prescribe.
Yes, that's right. I will. One thing about it, I don't hold it in. I share, even with my team. I'm very open about who I am and where I came from and how it drives the work we do. every day.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I want to now open the audience, open you all to questions. And I think all of our panelists are ready and willing and able to answer any of your questions. Want to just let you know that the camera is moving and that you'll have to move too if you want to ask a question, unless you have a great voice that projects. We have
It's over here, Doc.
our microphone over here.
Oh, it's going to walk around.
And yes, please, if you're over here, please walk around so that you don't walk in front of the camera. Microphone's over here. And may I give you a couple of ground rules about asking questions? One is, question always begins with who, what, when, where, or how, or why, and always ends with the intonation of your voice goes up. Everything else is a statement. So please ask questions. And you may direct them to a particular member of the panel, or you may direct your question to any and all of the members.
Okay.
And please give us your name, too.
Yep, sure. My name is Matthew McGinnity. I'm the communications manager for Interfaith Works. We work in Montgomery County to help end poverty in Montgomery County, Maryland. My question is for all of you. You guys, well, one of the panelists mentioned how only 3% of women make it through college, or coming from poverty make it through college. And one of the biggest things you guys talked about like local education, but one of the biggest barriers that I've found, and I feel that my generation has found, is the kind of financial strain that is placed on people that are just trying to get into college in general. I know some of you might have to tread lightly because you work with universities, but how would you guys address that issue of being able to get those people that coming from poverty just access of getting to college and higher education, since it is more important now?
Madam Moderator, do you want to take 2 or 3 questions and then we respond, or do you want to do them one at a time?
No, one at a time.
Okay, doke.
I'll just say a few things. One is particularly, we need to be careful. When we look at student loan debt, what we find is that those people who are struggling to repay are folks that are from lower socioeconomic economics, and that they take out student loans and they go to school and they're not finishing their degree. So those are the people, when we talk about the crisis around people defaulting on their student loans, that tends to be a higher share. So we need better counseling of helping people figure out where to go and go to the local, Montgomery County Community College, and not going to for-profit schools. That really sort of figuring out what works for them, what are good programs. There are there are Pell Grants, obviously, that can help folks into school. There are some local programs so there used to be, there's a program called the Assets for Independence program. The federal government hasn't funded it in the last few years, but that was a program that was really aimed at helping low-income people save for college, providing financial education, and then helping them, providing a lot of wraparound services in college to succeed. And I know a lot of states are looking at that program. There's a program in Arizona called Arizona Earn to Learn, where they're really trying to work with young students in high school who might not be seeing college as their future. But we have to be careful about where our young people are going to school and what kinds of debt that they're taking on.
I'll say this, and then I'll let you tell us. I'll say this, is that education is what made our country able to be a leader, and we used to fund it a lot better. Mm-hmm. When I went to the University of Memphis, we paid 70% of the cost of a student going. Now it's about, and I'm talking about the state, now it's about 29%, something like that. And tuition goes up and students have to borrow. Not only that, but I was able to go to school just about cost-free. And some of you are old enough to remember when the United States was competing with Sputnik and we wanted to get ahead. And even the federal government then and private organizations were funding so that students would go into STEM and whatnot, because we knew that we needed to fund education because we wanted our country to be cutting edge. We've lost some of that, and we've got to change that. And the problem with that crushing debt is that it makes people poorer. That undermines what we're trying to do.
We need to invest more in higher education, and we need to control costs. So I'm relatively proud of NYU in attempting to control costs. It's disgustingly expensive, and it's a very diverse place with a the highest proportion of financial aid students of any big private university that I know. But we're still absolutely pricing ourselves out of the ability to respond to the needs of many, many, many people. And there has to be some form of getting that under control by the university sector, in my opinion.
I agree with everything.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Andrew Ferreira, and I'm a journal production editor at the American Psychological Association. My question is, a lot of you have referenced that the federal government moves at a glacial pace, and state houses are known to affect us directly and impact the lives of American citizens immediately. So my question is to the entire panel, and that if you were elected governor and you had one milestone issue in policy to implement, and only one, which field would you tackle, which policy would you implement that would impact poverty in the immediate?
Thank you.
You should answer that.
If I were governor, it would be really a different world. But I think that the thing that is most proven effective and that states could do is to create, or if they have it, increase the generosity of a state earned income tax credit to complement the federal earned income tax credit.
That's why I wanted you to answer, because I'd go right there, putting in policies that changes the ability for people to get that education and to get the money they need to support their children.
I think we can also, I would really focus on making sure that people who are eligible for benefits are getting them. A lot of those are federal benefits, and particularly making sure that when mothers have children, they're in hospitals, having services there to make sure that they're getting federal benefits, and really thinking about what wraparound services the state can afford.
Yeah, if I was governor of the state of Florida, I'd probably, first of all, teach them how to vote, and
how to count.
And to count. How to vote too, but and count. But I would really focus on education and making sure that the things my colleagues here said really was dealt with in a comprehensive way. Earned income tax credits, wraparound services, to make sure that that we think of it in a holistic manner.
Next question.
Good morning, Elizabeth Arendt. I work with the Primary Care Coalition, also in Montgomery County, and I'm very proud that the culture in Montgomery County, I believe, is dedicated to making sure that people who are low income have access to services much more so than neighboring counties. The Primary Care Coalition supports a network of 10 safety net clinics, and the Montgomery Cares program, which enables people living under 250% of the federal poverty level who are residents of Montgomery County and don't have access to any other kind of insurance to get access to primary care and some specialty care. What has been very frustrating for me in the last year or so as county level policies are shifting around this program is the notion of that federal poverty level, because when you look at $12,000 for an individual, and the story that creates about what constitutes poverty and the actual cost of living. There are other indices that show that to actually make ends meet in a family of four in Montgomery County, you need $90,000 a year, which is absolutely shocking. So I have two questions. One is, when can we stop using the federal poverty level to set policy, knowing that the actual cost of living is there's vast discrepancies, right? The federal poverty level is applied nationally, but it doesn't capture the actual day-to-day reality of what poverty means from one location to another. And the second is, do you feel like there is growing momentum or behind initiatives like Medicare for All? I know we don't know what that means yet, even though a lot of people are talking about it. But is there growing momentum? Because I feel like there is. I feel like more people are realizing that even if they're middle class and they're educated, they are one disaster away from poverty themselves. And I include myself in that category.
Thank you. The first question is on federal policy regarding
Yeah.
what is the poverty level, poverty income level, and second is programs, for example, to alleviate poverty.
I'll address the first question. Very roughly speaking, in addition to deep poverty, which is 50% of the federal poverty line, and poverty, which is 100% of the poverty line, on average across the nation, about 200% of the poverty line is the family self-sufficiency standard. But there are very big local differences. So Montgomery County is very, very expensive. So to achieve family self-sufficiency, which means you're supporting your family without any government assistance at all, it would take about twice the poverty line. So, and one of the hardest things to do is to actually climb from just above the poverty line to just above the family self-sufficiency line. Many of our policies claw and tax back a dollar with one hand when they give a dollar with the other hand. So we need to focus on that journey from $24,000 a year to $48,000 or $50,000 a year. That area, which we've talked about almost not at all today, is very, very important. And it will have an effect on deep poverty by motivating people to get to that next level. If that next level looks like hell too, it's harder to get all enthusiastic about going there.
I thought you were going to say something about the supplemental poverty level. We have this official poverty measure, the supplemental poverty measure that's taking into account where people live and the cost of living and healthcare costs. It's just so much harder to measure, so we don't use it. It's particularly getting down to the local level, but housing costs are just such a critical part. And as Rosie talked about earlier, when the poverty level was created, it was the cost of food times 3, and now housing is so expensive. I heard somebody from San Francisco talking the other day. Someone has to work 5 minimum wage jobs, which minimum wage there is pretty high, in order to make ends meet. So in Montgomery County, it's expensive, but just the cost
We've known for a long time that the official poverty measure does not give an accurate reading of where we are. Our report is based completely on the preferred measure that Caroline mentioned, the supplemental poverty measure. It sounds like a technical inside baseball thing, but it really matters in terms of how to count.
Well, I'll just add that cities and counties locally is trying to create policies that address their own wage levels. And so I talked about St. Louis, Missouri, doing a minimum wage. In other communities around Georgia, Rochester, New York, all creating local wage level policies that address their needs. The challenge we're having is the state governments are preempting local authority to be able to set those wages because the private sector is complaining about the cost. So the answer to that for us, I want federal leadership, but we're not waiting. City leaders are addressing these issues on their own. And I do think there's a movement that you can, in terms of Medicare, services and support policy by the folks that are being elected in America right now. There is something happening that may cause changes at the state and federal level.
Do we have another questioner?
Yes, good morning. Good morning. I'm Suzanne McCartney. I'm an analyst at the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS. And I just wanted to ask, is there a way that we can frame federal policy either, as a narrative, as a story that addresses racial inequality and structural racism, but also somehow, brings in the broader, in a way that it brings in the broader interest, so that we're not just, that we need to, target Black children but also everyone's children, so that there's not so much, middle-class resistance or, white resistance to, really targeting needy children. And one thing I was thinking of, the Washington Post had an article this week that said, education funding, white children get about $23 billion more in educational funding than Black children, just because of the way that it's, so that's quite a gap. And that's one of those federal policies that, perpetuates inequality. So, when we evaluate policies, when we sort of pitch them to leadership and at conferences, is there some way that we can kind of frame these in a way that says, these children are everybody's children, they're all of our children, and also kind of target, Black and Hispanic children, children in immigrant families, the children who are.
Okay, let's get some responses.
Right.
Yeah, I do think that there is a way of doing that. When I took over this role 6 years ago, we had Baltimore, we had Trayvon Martin, and all of these other issues that were happening in cities all over America. And we created an initiative called REAL, Race, Equity, and Leadership. And the leadership part is the part that the National League of Cities is working on, helping local leaders to be able to communicate across cultures, to be able to communicate when something happens in your city, because it's not if, when something happens in your city, whether you are a person, you're white, Latino, or you are African American, how you communicate and manage the transparency and bringing the community together, no matter, again, the race of the issue. And I think that it's going to take us really being able to having developed skills in order to have these conversations and to recognize that in the 70s, 60s, 70s, even 80s and 2000s, there were policies that we designed and adopted, intentional or unintentional, had consequences on a certain population in your community. And it's not attacking you, it's just being able to say this policy had unintended consequences. What we're hoping to teach our elected officials is before they adopt a housing policy or approve a land use change, someone on the dais should ask, is this resolution, is this policy having negative implication on this zip code? Or is it supporting this zip code and not supporting that, so that policies are developed? But there is a way to do that, and it has to be in a safe environment. And I think, I see Dr. Evans coming up, the American Psychological Association has an opportunity to do that on a federal, state, and local level.
And I'll say this, that a part of what I think we have to do, which is why you heard me say some things, is that we have to tell everybody's story. People have to see themselves in the story, in the policy. And so when we know that there are counties in Pennsylvania where the white mortality rate dipped below that of Black people, policymakers need to know, and that came right out of poverty. So people need to be able to see themselves. So I say, tell the whole story, and that helps to grow our momentum to make changes.
Can I just add that part of that story is cost? So Larry mentioned the cost of child poverty, $800 billion to $1.1 trillion. The Urban Institute did a report with the Children's Defense Fund a couple years ago, and they had a package of policies, and they found that it would cost $77 billion to lift 60% of children out of poverty. So we are paying for child poverty, and really we're going to pay for it on the back end or invest in children and pay on the front end. And when we're talking about we don't have the money for it, I also do a lot of work in the wealth building areas, that we spend close to $400 billion subsidizing wealth in this country, asset building, preferential treatment for retirement savings, mortgage interest tax deduction. The vast majority of it goes to high-income people. There are resources, there is money, and those resources, we should be thinking about how we can use those to really support and lift up children.
And I'll just reinforce that last point. I do urge you to pick up the material at the back of the room on leaving, but we estimated 4 different policy packages that could reduce poverty. The least expensive was $8.7 billion and mostly rewarded work and lifted about 20% of kids out of poverty. The most expensive were between $90 and $110 billion a year and did lift 50% of the kids out of poverty. So there is a price range of these policies that could be selected, but all of them improve child poverty for the nation. If it costs $100 billion to reduce poverty in half compared to the $800 billion or $1.1 trillion that it costs per year to keep it, it's going to be cost effective to reduce child poverty as well as morally right. But it makes good economic business if we're patient enough to do it.
And the next question from the president of the American Association.
CEO.
I'm so sorry.
My
I'm
president
sorry.
is there.
Sorry, Madam President.
Yes,
You're
Arthur
all
Evans.
highly esteemed leaders.
Sure.
No matter your title.
Sure. Arthur Evans, CEO for the American Psychological Association. First of all, thank you all for an outstanding panel today. It was just really outstanding. And a special thanks for you, Rosie and Clarence, for sharing your personal stories. So many people watching today may be thinking, well, why is the American Psychological Association interested in deep poverty? What's the connection? And I think, Maureen, your question about the psychology of poverty and how it affects both the people who are experiencing it, but also those of us who have to make decisions or people who are in policy positions who have to make decisions about that. So you've alluded some to things that APA might be doing or psychologists might be doing in their communities, but I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about what can APA do on this issue, what can psychologists do in their local communities on this issue, and how can we really begin to shift the momentum in this country to take this issue on?
Oh, all of you are looking at me.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that we have a work group at the American Psychological Association, and we have actually 2 people here who are helping us to get that going. And we actually are going to develop a toolkit for psychologists to use. But even before, and we're going to release that probably in August, Kiana? Okay, everybody's nodding. We're going to be good. But even beyond that, before we do that, Americans really want great things for our country and for the people in our country. And we have to learn to tap into that. And then we have to make it clear that we aspire to equal opportunity for all. And honestly, we have got to combat the fear that people want to perpetrate with us to pit one group against another group, to make us think that if we do well by one group, if we don't let immigrants in, that it's going to somehow make us more safe. We've got to combat fear and help us to understand that we're all Americans and aspire to that thing that is higher in all of us. So I challenge you to go out and advocate with your state and local and federal leaders to begin to make changes. You have the power. You know, as Rosie, I tweet and put on Facebook all the time, we the people have charge of this country, and never let anybody take your power away from you. So we have some things that we can do, and we will prescribe some things. But I call on each and every one of you to go out and advocate for the kinds of changes you've heard my colleagues mention here, and we will make a difference, and we'll begin to make that difference tomorrow, if not day after tomorrow.
Well, agree with that 100%. One of the things that Dr. Evans and I talked about when he first took over this job is the opportunity for city leaders and APA to work together in local communities, because, you know, we have state associations, just like APA has state associations. And the issue of poverty is just, deep poverty is just one of those issues. You even talk about the impact of homelessness and some of the ways and why some of our citizens in our communities are homeless. The opiate and heroin epidemic is another opportunity. There's so many things that I think and know that we can partner on. And the reason why I'm asking for this partnership here today is because local leaders run for office to make their communities better. They're not necessarily running because they know everything about finance, about homelessness, about poverty. So they need professionals who have that background to knock on their city hall doors and say, I want to work with you on deep poverty because that's my expertise. I live in your community. I work in your community. So, Dr. Evans, we're ready at the National League of Cities to work with you and, Madam President, with you as well on deep poverty and in the future other issues, because the challenges in American cities, it's not going away. We just got to deal with them and make it better for everybody that lives there.
That's exactly right. We're ready. And
We're ready?
I go and talk to my mayor all the time about this, and he's good with it. He's very good. So I hope you know him.
Mayor Strickland? Yes.
Mayor Strickland.
I know
We
him
are
very
doing
well. I
it.
know all
Yeah.
my good mayors.
Strategy has already begun. Strategizing. Yes, please, let's have your question.
Hi there, my name is Ben Yoxall. I'm a senior at GW, and my question is, what role do local governments, state governments have in building the community ties, Dr. Davis, that you said were really influential in helping you get to where you are today?
What roles the federal...
So you mentioned in the beginning how influential your neighborhood was, your community was in helping you getting to where you are today. My question is, what role do state or local governments, if there's any role, do they play in creating those kind of communities, those bonds that really help kids in deep poverty rise above their station?
Yeah, your question threw me because when I was a child...
Excuse me, I'm so sorry to interrupt your thinking. We have to ask Dr. Clarence if it's okay for you to allow him to leave, because he has a plane to catch. He is apparently, of course, one vote against his departure.
Well,
Apparently, he has had enough of us in Washington.
No, Dr. Evans, my college roommate knows that I will be there forever for him. And I flew back here, and I got a flight out in an hour.
Go, man.
Oh, you need to go.
But I got to tell you, I want to just say a personal note. For 40 years, and it was 1979, his family walked in to the dorm room, and I was there by myself, and I'll never forget that. I was alone, and he had his mom, dad, and his sister and brother there. And I just admired them so much. And I am not surprised at how well you've done, Ace. I love you, and I'm just so proud of you. And anything we can do together as roommates forever, let me know. Thank you.
Thank
You guys continue.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you so much, Clarence. And we wish you the best. We know you're going to Florida, and some of us are happy for you, and some of us are not. But enjoy Enjoy the rest of your time here, and thank you for your participation on our panel. Now, excuse me, I'm sorry to have interrupted your question. Please restate it.
I think I've got it.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the question was in reference to my conversation about how important my neighborhood, my schools, and helping me to grow and get to be where I am. And part of the question, what are the structures and whatnot that federal, local, state governments can have in helping to make that possible again. And I said your question threw me because I felt like the policies helped to keep me in a poor neighborhood, but it was great because the neighborhoods weren't so segregated. My calculus teacher lived down the street from my father because we were so segregated that was the way it was. Now that we desegregate, the calculus teacher wouldn't live next door to the garbage man. But I think that some of the policies that we've talked about, some of the ones that Larry mentioned, I think we can change those. In Memphis, my mayor really is working to address some of the issues with poverty, and they didn't include everything from changes in the minimum wage to changes in the programs that are actually right there in the community. And importantly, it includes, he includes, in our organization that I'm affiliated with, include the people who are in the community to tell us what are the changes we need to make it possible for you to have a different life. We take the leadership in developing the partnerships that cut across government, corporations, nonprofits, all of those individuals living in the communities that change those structures. And some of those structures include the things that will help us to help individuals get jobs, help the children to get into education, increasing income in household, and just even placing people in jobs, looking at the transportation structures. I mean, just getting people to work. When we have situations where someone has to catch a lot of buses and still at the end of an hour and a half, still has to walk 2.5 hours to get to a job, those are the kinds of things that we have got to change.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosie. Next question.
Michael Schulman with APA. My question is, I don't question that our system of capitalism in this country is effective, and I can't argue of too many other systems around the world that would be better than ours. But within our system, how do we determine how we're worth? It was mentioned before, a minimum wage worker in San Francisco would have to have 5 minimum wage jobs to barely make ends meet. That person may have very good skills to not be in that sort of predicament situation. And I was thinking yesterday, and maybe this is a hyperbole example, but Bryce Harper, it was calculated with his new contract, he will be earning approximately $40,000 per bat. So if that could please be addressed. Thank you.
You can do it.
I think part of what you're calling out is that another perspective on everything we've been talking about is inequality, not just poverty. And I will add 2 things to that thought. The first is that up until a certain point in wealth of a nation, the wealthier people are, the longer they live. But after a certain point, absolute wealth does not contribute to life expectancy. What contributes to life expectancy is equality of income. Inequality causes short lives after a certain point. Absolute income shortens lives before that point. It is in our collective health interests to reduce inequalities in America. We all will live longer, not just poor people, not just middle-class people, but rich people actually have a disadvantage in life expectancy in more unequal societies and communities. That is not a piece of knowledge widely understood in America. So we've talked several times today about how reducing child poverty can be good for the entire nation, not just for poor kids. This is another take on it. That's my answer.
Do we have any other questions?
So thank you very much for the beautiful discussion, by the way. I'm Annette Stierman. I work for the APA. And I was wondering, because you were stressing that investments in education and investments in a lot of housing projects and in holistic approaches is very important. And when I hear of investing, I think, okay, somebody has to pay, right? How would you, or can we, change the rhetoric? Because you were talking about the storytelling, that actually says and teaches us all, including me, paying too much tax is stupid.
Paying too much tax is stupid. Is that what you
How do
said?
we counter that?
How do we counter that? Yeah. So part of what our work group is working on is actually changing some of the narratives about poverty and whatnot. And I liked what Lara had to say about learning how to frame stories. And I think part of the discussion about taxes, I think that we don't tell people the truth enough and don't tell them the stories about what happens when we don't pay and how it hurts so many of us. So we've got to tell more of that story. And that's a part of what I think too, when we talk about fear and making people afraid that if they pay taxes, that they aren't going to have enough. That's a distraction. And so we need to change that narrative to help people understand what is real and what we really are paying for. And we're paying more than the $10 that it took out of my paycheck to help to fund the pothole in my street. Because actually, if I pay for that pothole, then my car is not likely to have a blown out tire. That's the story that we don't tell well enough.
I agree.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Camille Arrington. I'm the program director for the DMV Police Athletic League. We currently oversee 10 sites across the region where we connect law enforcement agencies with youth in their communities. All the communities that we serve are impacted greatly by poverty, so I really appreciate all the insight offered and just the knowledge that we can really work together towards a better future. However, my question is, does the approach to poverty differ at all when you really look at it when it's coupled with extreme violence and also just like the growing epidemic? So for instance, we have sites in Baltimore. It was a lot of crazy stuff happening there last week, so I wonder just how do we look at it when you look at it with all these other issues happening in the community?
Well, so I mean, I think, yes, it does differ. And in terms of just stress on children, so the extent to which they're experiencing violence, the stress that goes along with that. So I think for those children, there's more that's needed to help them get over those experiences. Certainly, there's research that's done that the more hardships and stressors that children experience, that has real implications for their health and their future success. So I think everything we're talking about, children who are experiencing and seeing violence, it's sort of escalated and the resources that they need around them are that much more important.
I believe the two most toxic things to kids' development are poverty and violence. And so we haven't talked about violence today, and until you brought it up, it is very, very important. It is loosely correlated with poverty and income. It's not perfectly correlated. Maybe Rosie will be able to talk the next president of APA into having an initiative on violence, which would be a very powerful complement to an initiative on deep poverty.
Yes, and since our CEO is here, I can just direct him to
look into it.
Direct him to look.
You got help if you need it.
That's exactly right. Shall I leave a final story, or shall we just say thank you?
No, please. Tell the story.
On what happens to children. So I'll tell a story about my son when he went to 7th grade, and he went from one system to another. And in that system, he wasn't used to writing in cursive or writing with a ballpoint pen. So he'd do his homework at home, take it to school, and because of the reinforcement he got, he would leave it in his locker. And we kept having problems. I finally called a meeting with all of his teachers because meeting one-on-one wasn't working. I called all of his teachers and his principal, because I decided my child was going to public school and I would be the mother from hell to make sure everything worked right. So I called a meeting and I said to them, let me just tell you this, you will deal with my son now, or you will deal with him when he's coming through your window to burglarize your home. That's the difference at education. The principal started helping my son, and so now he's a proud graduate of NYU.
Really?
Yeah.
And his mother would still come through the window. Watch out, NYU. I'd like to bring our program to a close, and I'd like to do two things. One is to ask one final question, because here we are in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and we have a tremendous amount of influence. We seem to have a few political problems these days. And I wonder about where the political will is coming from for us as people, as well as for our leaders. Where is the will coming from, and is there any will coming to help us move forward, to help us achieve what the Academy of Sciences has said, the reduction of child poverty, to help us achieve what Caroline has said about changing young people's lives from while they're in utero, the effect that we can have. Where is the political will coming from? We know the will is coming from APA, we know from the League of Cities and many, many of the organizations that you represent here. But as a country, where are we going to get the political will and the political leadership to deal with the problems of poverty?
I will begin. I think there are multiple influences that have to be brought to bear on the political process to develop the will. What the Academy's report does, in my opinion, is it says child poverty causes long-term and short-term problems. Child poverty is not an intractable problem. It is solvable. And child poverty can be cut in half by investments that are significant investments that will return even more significant savings. It gives the lie to the idea that nothing can be done. So we have to keep the notion that something can be done, that it's in our power to do it in front of the political process. And then other things will happen. Almost none of the major social legislation that's improved poverty has been passed by a single party. Almost, not all, but most of them have been bipartisan efforts. So we are going to have to find a political, this is not the Academy again, this is Larry, a political consensus to enact policies that are consistent with our values, but evidence-based and would really work.
And I'll just add to that. I think as we're trying to get attention, move the needle, bringing it back to what is the cost that we're already bearing, and this idea of paying the cost down the line or investment. And really that calculus shows that investing in children has a payoff. And I think if sort of keeping the eye on that, and that's why the Academy's work on what is the cost of poverty is so important, because he's really quantified those two pieces.
And Rosie, what is your organization doing to help stimulate the political will for change in poverty?
Part of what we're doing is using our evidence-based science to bring the facts, because I think we need to do that. And then we plan to have congressional briefings so that our congressional leaders understand the issues that that we face. And then we're also trying to empower psychologists throughout the country to know what they can do in their local communities, not only in the services that they deliver, but how they can become better advocates for the changes that we need to have happen. And then we'll keep on being a voice so that we strengthen people and help people to know that they have the power to make a difference. And then I want you to look for our report, because I have assembled a team of really leading experts in poverty that will help to give us more specific solutions that we can talk about in the coming months.
Thank you so much. We have challenged, you have challenged all of us, and certainly all the members of this panel. And to close, I would like the panelists to challenge all of you. I'd like each of the panelists to make one statement, make one challenge to you that you feel members of our audience can carry through to help in dealing with the issue of entrenched poverty.
I'm going to let us start with Caroline.
So I would say, I mean, there's so many different aspects, and really thinking about where is your comparative advantage? Is it in local schools or mental health facilities that we can kind of bring services to people? And then I would ask you to challenge the people around you about what they can do.
I'm going to take 1 second to thank all the committee members of the National Academy panel, because this was a collective effort, and all of the staff led by Suzanne Lemenestrel. Put your hand up, Suzanne, so people know who you are. So that indicates that we need collective efforts. So I would encourage people for collective efforts, but I'd say know the truth and tell the truth.
That's good.
I love it, and thank you. I love that report, and we'll use that as part of our evidence-based information that we put out there. So I would say know the truth, go out and vote, take somebody with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot, and I really feel privileged to have been able to participate in this discussion. And I'd like to ask Rosie to please give us closing remarks.
Well, thank you. I didn't know that I'd get to do that, but I am happy to do that. I am just thrilled with having been given this microphone as president of the American Psychological Association to bring this issue of deep poverty forward. And I am so grateful to my colleagues who have helped to actually frame it and make it real. I want you all to know that we can make a difference. We do not have to have deep poverty in this country. We can change lives for everyone. We can claim the American dream. We, the people, can make a difference with Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, Muslim Americans, white Americans, women, men, and children. All of us, I believe, too, even if we don't even want to focus on the adults, know that we can focus on our children and make a difference in our lives. We can do that. I invite, encourage, and challenge you to make that difference.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for being a great moderator. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the folks who are watching on live stream. Many resources, obviously, you've heard about some of them. As you leave here today, please pick up the paper takeaways with resources, and of course you have 3 incredible people here who I'm sure have much time on their hands, who will be able to talk with you even further. Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you.
Thank you.